Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Jeremy Fernandez. Coming up, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and China's President Xi Jinping prepare to meet on the sidelines of the G20 summit. The world's population officially hits 8 billion, but fertility rates are in decline. And with the cost of living rising, food charities are seeing more and more people reaching out for help. Joining me on the panel, the CEO of the Indian Link Media Group, Pawan Luthra. In Canberra, economist and former Labor Minister Craig Emerson. Demographer at the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods, Liz Allen. And in Melbourne, Foreign Affairs Specialist and Liberal Party member Erin Watson. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook as always too. Anthony Albanese is moments away from one of the most important meetings of his political career, a one-on-one sit-down with China's President Xi Jinping at the G20 summit in Bali. President Xi has not met with any Australian Prime Minister since 2016 when Malcolm Turnbull was in office. Relations between Australia and China have been particularly frosty since 2018 when the federal government banned Chinese telco giant Huawei from providing equipment for Australia's 5G network. In late 2020, China slapped multiple tariffs on Australian agricultural products, and military control of the South China Sea remains an ongoing geopolitical issue. The Treasurer Jim Chalmers has been with the Prime Minister in Bali, and he says he hopes Australia and China can find some common ground.
If this meeting helps to stabilise the relationship, if it's conducted in a calm and consistent and considered way, a way that lets us raise the issues that are troubling us, but where there's a sense of working together, where there is agreement, where there is common ground, then I think that is a really, really important start.
And the United States is also working on its relationship with China. The Chinese president met with the US President Joe Biden for 3 hours last night ahead of the official start of this summit. The pair talked about China's stance on Taiwan, action on climate change and the war in Ukraine, including the ever-present threat of nuclear war. It's not clear if anything was actually resolved, but President Biden says he doesn't believe China has imminent plans to invade Taiwan. Erin Watson, let's get back to this talk between Anthony Albanese and Xi Jinping. What is the most reasonable outcome from it?
I think that the most successful outcome from all of this is just that they are in a room together and actually having a bilateral meeting. This is the beginning of hopefully a much more productive relationship with China, but that's got to start somewhere. And I just think that initial conversation, that will be seen as an absolute success by this government and probably by the general public as well, that after 6 years, we're finally having some kind of ministerial contact. And this is, or not ministerial contact, but Prime Minister and President contact. So this is really significant, and I think that this just goes to show the value of these forums like the G20 to bring people together, as you've just pointed out, with Joe Biden, with Anthony Albanese and so many more bilaterals that will be taking place over the coming days.
Craig, as Erin has pointed to, there has been some ministerial contact up till this point. Is it a sign that China is slowly changing its position, or are we just reading too much into it?
No, it's not reading too much into it. China is welcoming the willingness and desire of the Australian government to reopen dialogue. As you said in your introduction, phone calls hadn't been returned after about 2018. I know the previous government ministers on the Australian side were trying to contact their counterparts, and those efforts were not returned. In terms of expectations, this is not a negotiation about, trade deals or removing trade restrictions or so on. It's really for two people to get to know each other. Typically what happens as a result of that is they say, well, we'll get our people to work on this or to work on that. So, if there were absolute, concrete outcomes from this, I'd be pleasantly surprised, but it really isn't. Just to support Erin, sometimes this summit season is a bit underrated because, sure, what happens in the summits is a bit stage managed, but it's important. Even more important is the opportunity for leaders to meet in a sense, on neutral ground. You know, Anthony Albanese is not going to China to have a discussion. Xi Jinping's not going to Australia. They're meeting in Bali, and it's a very nice place at Nusa Dua, by the way.
I want to bring in Jennifer Sue at this point. Jennifer is a research fellow in the Public Opinion and Foreign Policy program at the Lowy Institute. Jennifer, welcome to the program. Thanks for being here. I want to ask you, we know this relationship is of critical importance to Australia, but what about on the Chinese side? How important is this to them?
Well, here in Australia, everything is China adjacent. So there's a China angle to most things we talk about in politics today, but that's not the same for China. Australia is probably on the edges or the peripheries of Xi Jinping's focus. Xi Jinping has centralized so much of power into his hand, and he's responsible for making foreign policy decisions, national security issues. So at the top of his mind will be the US-China relationship. And so the meeting here allows Prime Minister Albanese to bring forth to the table, to the agenda, some of the issues and concerns Australia has had over the last 5 or 6 years between the last two leaders meeting. So it's an opportunity to bring to the forefront and have it on top of Xi Jinping's agenda what Australia's concerns are and what regional issues that ought to be dealt with together between Australia and China.
So senior Chinese officials have used this language repeatedly about meeting Australia halfway. This has been language used by Li Keqiang, by Wang Yi. What does that actually mean, meeting Australia halfway?
So it's fairly flexible. As with a lot of state rhetoric, there's a lot of room for interpretation and manoeuvring here. I think one of the things that China has brought to the agenda is that, or to our attention, is its concern, its anxieties over the AUKUS agreement, Australia's desire to acquire nuclear submarines. This is not just the concern that China has, but also one that is shared by our Southeast Asian neighbours as well. Over the issue of Taiwan, China sees Taiwan as a domestic issue. And so the visit that we saw in August made by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, the subsequent drills all indicate that China sees Taiwan as a very much domestic issue, that any attempts to do so otherwise is a provocation. And China wants Australia to see that it is a domestic issue and to take heed of that.
Craig, on those issues, Jennifer mentions AUKUS, Taiwan. It doesn't really seem, on the current stance, that there's a lot of room to move for Australia. Would that be right?
Well, look, again, these meetings are not usually very robust in the sense of, you know, trying to obtain a win. They are very convivial. I had the opportunity of meeting Xi Jinping in 2013 with Julia Gillard at the Boao conference. And he's quite an affable person and thoughtful, I thought. Anyway, that's just my opinion. Others might have different opinions. And I think the idea of meeting halfway, another way of looking at it, is what Anthony Albanese said repeatedly in the last 24 hours. He goes into this meeting without preconditions. And it is a temptation, you know, because the barricades on both sides, so you've got to insist on this or insist on that. That's not how these meetings are constructed and how they are conducted. If you say, well, we're only going to meet unless you agree at the meeting to remove all trade restrictions, well, that's futile and won't happen. So it is wise on both sides. That's what they mean by meeting halfway. They're not going to say, well, we'll only meet under these particular circumstances.
Pawan, I'm interested in your view on the other key issues for Australia here. We've got, human rights on the agenda. Trade is a really big one, isn't it?
It is. Just to recap a couple of things which have been said earlier, I think this working from home for the G20 countries hasn't really worked. We have had one member who has gone on an unprovoked attack on its neighbour and another who's busy throwing its weight around its neighbourhood.
Leaders working remotely and not kind of getting that face-to-face time?
Face-to-face interaction, more room to manoeuvre, not having those many meetings. But at the same time, I think Australia has done exceedingly well in the last 3 to 4 years on different new opportunities which have emerged post-China sanctions. They have structured the deal, as mentioned, by Jennifer about AUKUS. They have dusted off the Quad and done some wonderful things in this new relationship between Japan, the United States, India. They have signed a new trade agreement with India, the ECTA, and they're on the verge of, the reports I read, of signing something new with the United Kingdom. So Australia has looked at this as an opportunity to reposition itself in the world stage. And I'm quite sure that China is watching this quite closely. And they also now want to get back into the action, because China has also suffered maybe around the margins, but with increasing coal prices has affected the steel industry, which has in fact flowed onto the housing industry, which has created some challenges in the property market in China. They've also had some food scarcity by not being able to pick up all their exports from Australia. So it's in China's interest also to resume discussion. And I guess, as Craig has said, that if they can return phone calls, if the Chinese ministers can return phone calls of Australian ministers, that will be a good outcome from this meeting between Prime Minister Albanese and President Xi.
Liz, I'm interested in your view on how the public perception of China has changed over the last 5-6 years, because there are a lot of indicators that suggest it's really turned south, hasn't it?
We've had COVID. We've had a global pandemic that quite a significant proportion of the world's population has blamed on China. We also, during the COVID period, had governments and senior officials in this country point the finger at China and make really, really unhelpful comments about people who had established a new life in Australia to go home. Home was here. And of course, that included people of Chinese origin. In amongst all of this, we had serious cases of discrimination and racism towards Asian Australians on our streets during COVID. We've got a lot of work to do here in both mending the relationship with China, but also mending the relationship with ourselves, because we've ultimately injured ourselves in this process, because many Australians have Asian heritage. And I really fear the fact that during this particularly COVID period, we've had issues around whether or not Asian Australians had to denounce their allegiances to a foreign government and so on. And we still see that reflected in exchanges, particularly between the last government and Australians and key public servants and so on. I really think that Australia has a lot of work to do here, and it's not going to cut it at some kind of fancy schmoozing at a summit season, because most Australians just kind of see that as a photo opportunity, I suspect, and would probably do far better, and our government and the Chinese government would be far better placed if we saw an earnest, ongoing discussion. I'm not sure who's the issue on our side or somewhere else, but there needs to be more of an earnest commitment here for Australians to feel safer too.
Jennifer, can I get your reflections on that? Because the Lowy Institute has done some research in this regard about the perceptions of China in Australia. What have you found?
So over the last 5 years, public opinion, Australian public opinion of China has declined quite precipitously, and now it is at its lowest point since 2018. But having said that, the Lowy Institute also has a Being Chinese in Australia public opinion survey, which surveys ethnic Chinese or people of ethnic Chinese origins, and there is a much more positive view towards China compared to the broader Australian population. People, on the whole, of ethnic Chinese origins are much more see China as much more of an economic partner rather than as a national security threat. And so here, going back to Liz's comment, there is a perception problem here that there is a portrayal of China and unfortunately, in some cases, people of Chinese origins or Chinese heritage are seen as a security threat to Australia. And that hasn't done well for Australia's social cohesion at all over the last 4 or 5 years. So I think I agree with Liz that there is much more that the Australian government and the Australian public, and those who work in, have a public role in Australian society to mend those bridges between the population here and also with people of Chinese heritage in Australia. There's road to be made, and we are in a multicultural society, and we celebrate that, and let us embrace that and make those amends public and declare that, we are all Australians, irrespective of where our place of birth may be.
Erin, Jennifer mentioned... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Liz, go.
Yeah, what concerns me, we talk about social cohesion in Australia, particularly during COVID and the little period before. We're starting to see this notion of social cohesion as being this kind of form of neo-assimilation, whereby we don't really want to talk about our difference. This fear that if we talk about our difference, we other each other. But at the same time, that means that we can't celebrate our difference and welcome our difference. And I really fear that this kind of drive toward a social, to increasing social cohesion is actually being misunderstood as this kind of, we all need to be the same. We don't need to be the same to be socially cohesive. We just need to recognise and celebrate that difference is good and it makes us strong.
Erin, can I get your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you can probably see me sitting here going, well, it's interesting because, I live in a culturally and linguistically diverse household, to put a colloquialism on it. My partner's Sri Lankan and I was there making pol sambal last night and kotu, anyway. So I think that the point is that not all Australians, particularly, I know that there's an angle here about being white Australian and not understanding or appreciating or embracing and celebrating difference. And, there's a lot of people, this isn't coming at it from a big data perspective, but there are a lot of people out there like myself and like others who live these really, intertwined lives and living between two cultures. And I think that ought to be celebrated, that there are people who can do that. And sometimes I feel like, culturally, we eat Sri Lankan food probably 4 nights a week in our house. So in some senses, and I'm not saying that food is the be-all and end-all when it comes to cultures, but it is a really big part of it. And I think that we should celebrate that and acknowledge it and look at where we're doing well, because there are so many people out there like that. Of course, when half the people in this country are born overseas, there are going to be interracial and intercultural relationships and partnerships and children that do get to walk that line between two, and that's such a fabulous thing in this country.
And I just saw it over the weekend when I was watching the cricket. The T20 World Cup has been on. And there have been crowds of multicultural people and other people who have been out all the stadiums. And what's been fantastic, Jeremy, is to see the parents in the colours of the country of their birth, whereas their children are in different colours altogether. So if India is playing some other nation, it's always fascinating, especially Australia, to go to the grounds and see parents all in the Indian blues, whereas the Australian Indian children are all in their Australian gear. So it's just fantastic to see families who can go in different directions, yet go home together and enjoy either the sambal or the steak.
Can I clumsily segue back to the G20?
I was going to talk about Sri Lankan curries.
I know, we'll share recipes later. But Craig, I want to pick up on this point that Jennifer mentioned earlier on, that Australia is perhaps a lower tier priority than the US relationship with China. This is for the Chinese side. How influential will that relationship be on the outcomes for Australia?
Oh, look, it's pretty important, but everyone's reasonably mature in these meetings, and there will be differences that neither side will be able to resolve. It's okay to acknowledge differences between countries and work on those areas in which you can make progress, but not, say, well, we're only going to talk to you if you become a democracy. Well, Xi Jinping will say, see you later, right? So it's as simple as that. And going back to that 2013 discussion, Julia Gillard said, Mr. President, I need to raise human rights issues with you. And he said, of course you do. And then spoke at length about the challenges within China on that. So what I'm saying is there will be some differences, whether they're geostrategic differences. We've got 2 people in jail in China. It would be wonderful if in time that gets resolved in their favour. But what I'm saying is that let's work on the common ground, as was mentioned in the introduction, rather than emphasising the differences. And again, I'm not blaming the media, but the media, to get a story, are going to tell a story of the differences between China and Australia, whereas the 2 leaders will be talking about finding that common ground.
Speaking of finding common ground, Jennifer, the fallout from this deteriorating relationship with China over the last few years was that Australia fostered a greater relationship with countries like India. How tricky does it make it for Australia then to kind of carry those 2 things at the same time, diplomatically, and accommodate that wider circle?
Well, as Pawan would know, Indian Australians are the second fastest growing population in Australia. So, I think there's much more room for Australia to begin to understand India. We see the coverage of China in our daily newspapers, radio, TV coverage, very frequently. But how often do we hear about India being covered in Australian media outlets? I would say infrequently. So I think there is room for a greater bilateral relationship between Australia and India. Indian Australians are one of the largest growing segments of Australia's population. So, and the Quad, as Pawan mentioned, is something that Australia is committed to. So I think there's room for Australia's foreign policy to explore, and national security establishment to explore in terms of Australia's improving and increasing and strengthening Australia's bilateral relationship with India.
Jennifer, I want to thank you for being on the program with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jennifer Su is a research fellow in the Public Opinion and Foreign Policy program at the Lowy Institute. Well, most of us can't avoid the increasing cost of living, be it at the petrol pump, supermarket, paying rent, or when the electricity bill rolls in. Some people are increasingly having to decide between eating and paying those bills. Charities that deliver food services say they're seeing more and more people give up the groceries to pay for other essentials. The Drum's Bethan Smolenick has the details.
Australians across the country are feeling the pinch of rising costs. For those who are already struggling, food is an expense some can no longer afford.
We've seen an increase in them coming and asking us for sandwiches and things that they can put in their children's lunch boxes, or items that they can use the next day to have for breakfast, because they skip the meal otherwise.
So what are the sandwiches going out for tonight? We've just made tuna, chicken.
Josie's been working in St Vincent de Paul's kitchens and handing out food for over a decade. She's never seen queues so long. Between July and September, St Vincent saw a 20% increase in the number of people seeking assistance in New South Wales, compared to that same period in 2021.
Thank you. Thank you.
Addie Road Food Pantry in Sydney's Inner West is also seeing more people come through its doors. The charity provides free bread, fruit and vegetables to its clients, as well as other discounted groceries.
The only area where you can save money is your food costs, because no one will cut off your food, but they'll cut off your electricity. If you can't pay rent, you become homeless.
Vouchers worth $10 are given to help people pay for essential food and household items. Between July and October, more than $27,000 worth of vouchers were handed out. That's a 160% increase from the same period last year.
What we're seeing is an arrow of need that's going up. There's no plateau, it's going up. So this is why we're very alarmed, because we believe that this is the tremor and there's a bigger earthquake that is awaiting us.
Inflation isn't just impacting individuals who access services like Addie Road, but for the organisations themselves, the costs are also rising. With Christmas around the corner, they're calling for financial donations so that they can keep helping those who need it most.
We don't know how long we can continue because we don't get any reoccurring funding from the government. In fact, we have to buy a lot of the food that goes into our pantries.
The value of these services goes beyond providing people with food.
When people come to our vans and we're talking to them, we actually find out sometimes we're the only people they speak to all day. So what we're finding is that due to the increase of cost of living, they're actually not able to afford to participate within community.
It's not just come here, fill up your basket and go home and we'll see you next week. It's more than that. It's really a sense of community belonging, security, safety, because to be poor is not an accident of nature. It's the result of a deliberate economic system.
Liz, I want to bring you in here because you have some experience with the sorts of themes people are talking about there. You've been very open in tweeting and speaking about it. I don't suppose any of that comes as a surprise to you.
No, and as you say, I have my own lived experience of needing to access this help of Vinnie's, in fact. And I think that what we're seeing at the moment is a cluster of failures within multiple systems that are harming working Australians. These are working Australians that have a job. They're working hard alongside people who are requiring government support. Governments are now relying on the support of good-natured Australians and charities to do the work that they haven't, and they've let go, really. That's what's happening. This is a policy choice of letting Australians go and hoping that some alternative safety net is going to capture them and feed them. And I think that this is the basis of our lives, is being safe, being safely housed and being fed. And we are not delivering as a country on these fundamental things. I still remember the pain of being hungry and being thirsty in a way that I can't quite put in words. But for someone that skips a meal or goes without, it is a physical pain and an emotional trauma that is lasting. So we are not only starving people and letting people go hungry, but we are traumatising so many young, particularly young people and already vulnerable Australians. And it's completely a political and policy choice. Raise income support, consider where we can help.
How desperate do people get before they start reaching out for help? Why is it that we so often hear about people who are in severe hardship before they reach out for help for the first time?
Because it's embarrassing. We have this kind of myth in our society that everyone's doing well. And if you ask, people on the street, how you going? And they'll say, yeah, great, everything's great. So we kind of have this facade that we all wear, and it's a protection, right? But the reality is that not everyone that tells you they're doing okay is doing okay. They may not have electricity at home because it's been cut off. They may not have toilet paper. They may not have food, or they're constantly thinking, what am I going to feed the kids tomorrow? What can I do to reduce what I'm doing in terms of perhaps the parents are eating or spending money on to let the kid live? This is extraordinary. And these are the types of negotiations so many Australians are having every day. It's not their individual choice. They are not alone, but the shame and the social condemnation makes them feel that they have to hide, they have to isolate. And that, to me, is probably one of the worst things about this, is that when we condone poverty by allowing it to happen, we say it's okay, and we tell the people it's happening to that we don't care. It's not individual fault. It's a system of a cluster of trouble that has failed people.
Erin, how is it that we've ended up in this position?
That's a great question. I think Liz makes a really good point about the systemic failures here. And, you know, if you want to judge a society, you should look at how you treat the most vulnerable people. And I think that this is where Australia is really failing right now. And my observation of this and, you know, again, what Liz has said as well, is around the rise of the working poor in Australia. So these are the people who have full-time jobs. They are earning low or just above minimum wage. I mean, if you think about the average wage in this country is around $80,000 per year, and then the average household income is probably around $120,000, $130,000 per year. The median is so much less than that. I think women's median incomes are around, you know, $25,000, $30,000, $40,000. Maybe Liz, being the demographer, will know those data, but it's really, really low. Right? And so if you think about the cost of living, if you're a professional watching this show or out there, you know, making, you know, in the policy discourse and policy conversations, imagine all of the stress that you're under right now and then trying to do that on $30,000 a year. And Liz said that the support is not enough in this country because I don't even know how you pay your rent and you pay for food and you pay for all of the school supplies that you still need even in a public school for your kids. Like, it just doesn't add up. And I think that, you know, this is a systemic failure. This is, and it's a really big policy challenge because, you know, if you put, again, this kind of goes back to, you know, the way that we spent our way out of COVID as well, how we manage the current economic climate with ensuring that there's enough money for those people who are absolutely, you know, completely vulnerable out there in our community. And, you know, this is also not just about This Today in Food, because I'm astonished by these stories that have been coming out particularly on the ABC in the last couple of weeks, but also last night on Four Corners, talking about how we treat young children who are incarcerated in this country. So I think that we've got a lot of work to do in terms of looking at how we treat the most vulnerable people in Australia right now, and we've got to do it really quick smart.
Craig, the federal budget was handed down a few weeks ago. You're not a Labor minister now, obviously, but was it a missed opportunity for the government to offer more support to those people who are doing it tough with this cost of living crisis?
Well, let's see what the May budget brings, and I'm not seeking just to deflect the question. We've just had a really enlightened discussion about very low wages in this country, and that a lot of people who are really struggling are actually working. You might recall Anthony Albanese holding up a $1 coin saying, when he was asked, will you support an increase in the minimum wage that is as great as inflation? And he said, yes, it's $1 an hour. $1 an hour extra. And for that, he was told by then Prime Minister Morrison, he's a loose unit, a whole lot of people said, oh, this is shocking, this is terrible that people could get $1 an hour increase in their minimum wage. And one of the first things that happened under the Labor government is that minimum wage case was approved by the Fair Work Commission. So that's something, but it's not everything. And one of the factors that is contributing to this, but only one, has been all of the really bad inclement weather, which has forced up the price of fresh food in particular. Now, there were problems before, but we saw that on that chart the rise in the last little while, and a lot of that has been caused by floods. We hope that that'll be resolved. Let's wait till the May budget to see if there's something, you know, more enduring. But I think the case has been made for these charitable organisations maybe to get some financial support on an ongoing basis, because I don't think they're ever going to run out of work.
Liz, can I get your thoughts on that?
You can't tell people to wait until May. You know what I mean? Like, you can't say wait until May and then we might feed you. It's still November. That's 6 months away. And, you know, 6 months of living through what Liz calls, you know, a traumatic experience. And, you know, I really look to her on what that's like. But, you know, we can't be saying, oh, we might, you know, give you some cost of living relief in May.
Yeah, I actually didn't. I didn't say that, and it's a good little manoeuvre to suggest that I say do nothing until May. We're talking about budgets. There will be a budget in May. I just said, you might have missed this bit, but I just said that there is a case to support those charitable organisations, and in the meantime give them pay rises. There's a second group that's got a pay rise, which is aged care workers. It's quite a substantial pay rise. They will say rightly it's not enough, but real wages fell for 10 years, and now real wages at least have some chance. If we can get control of the price rises that are going on, at least wages are going up.
Liz,
so
can
I'm
I
not
ask you
saying
about
do
that
nothing
point?
until May.
Yeah,
Liz, on that point about lifting the minimum wage, right, and wage for low-paid workers, because when we did have that debate under the previous government, there was so much resistance to lifting
right.
that wage for the lowest paid workers. Do you have a sense of why that is? Like, why that is such an issue that just kind of rubs people up the wrong way?
So two things. I think giving charities government money to do the government's job is a weird kind of parallel logic, but point taken, at least the money needs to get to the people. This issue of whether people want minimum wages to increase, what is so peculiar about Australia is that there is so many doing it really well, particularly people of a particular generation or series of generations that are doing very well wealth-wise. And so when it comes to Australia's progress, there's this fear that progress can happen and the poor and the vulnerable can be the cost or the collateral damage, because so long as the people at the top end of town are doing U-Butte, then that's all that matters. So there's this kind of perverse story that's kind of tapping into this notion that I guess of kind of some kind of aspirational thing. We want to be great, and if I'm earning this and someone's earning less, then they're not quite good enough. We've been sold an absolute lie. We need to reverse this kind of pernicious notion that people who are below the median income or are any less worthy as humans. They don't work less hard. In fact, they're probably working harder in many cases. They just don't have the wealth.
If I might, Liz, government officials are not good at giving out food. I mean, I think we need to understand the limitations. I would rather actually have Foodbank or St Vincent de Paul delivering those community services. When I was in Parliament, there was a lot of these groups.
Volunteers. It's not
I'm
their
saying
job.
support them.
It's the government's job to deliver the money, and they've got Social Security as a very strong mechanism to do that.
But I'm saying that if you ask a whole lot of government officials to deliver those services, they probably won't do it very well because they're not well trained and well versed in it. If you support the community organisations, and I'm agreeing that you should, but I don't know that Commonwealth Public Service handing out food packages is the right way to go. We may just have a difference on that, but it's a legitimate point of discussion.
Jeremy, there were about 220 organisations which during COVID times helped the community without judging and with dignity. I think this is what you had mentioned earlier about having dignity. And I believe that the government can support these community organisations, but if the forefront work can be done by the community organisations in terms of putting in their time, their effort, but having financial support from the government, that could be one way to go forward on this. A couple of other things. Firstly, food is a basic human right, and in a country which has got so much food security, to have people go hungry is an absolute crime. There are about 13% of the people from the general population and 32% from the indigenous population who suffer from food insecurity. And we need to address this now. There was an opportunity to perhaps relook at some of the tax cuts and redivert that money to help the people most vulnerable. And I have a firm belief that Australians would understand that if the argument is prosecuted for them that these tax cuts may not come through, but the money is actually going to help people at the very lowest end of the economic ladder.
Even if it was a broken political promise.
Well, I mean, again, you readjust your promises. I mean, there are people who are suffering, who are going hungry. And that, I think, if explained to most Australians, they would understand why they're not getting that extra $30 in their pay packet. But it's actually going to help the most vulnerable in our community.
Thank you all for your reflections on that. It's obviously a really, really important issue, and I'm not quite sure one that's easily resolved. Now today, the world's estimated population has officially ticked over to 8 billion people. The latest figures from the United Nations reaffirms our numbers are growing and fast. But there are also predictions we'll hit a decline in the next few decades. Since the end of World War II, the global population has tripled, with a peak expected in 2100 at almost 10.5 billion people. But the actual fertility rate has been going down, as you can see in green here. In fact, by 2100, the growth rate is projected to be just 0.1% compared to a peak in 1968 of 2.1%. Back then, the average woman was having 5 children. Today, women are giving birth to around 2 children each on average. So the projected population peak of 10.4 billion won't be because of increased fertility, but instead from people just living longer. Now, Liz, depending on who you ask, population growth and decline are just as bad as each other, right? So you find alarmists on both sides. Is there a sweet spot in between where we can have lots of people and be sustainable at the same time?
It all comes back to what we do. Our actions as individuals and as communities and countries and so on. I think whenever we talk about population and people, we tend to kind of see a bit of fear among people, particularly after we've just had a conversation about living standards and the costs of living.
And so it's reasonable fear, right? I mean, either side of that equation, it's reasonable fear.
Yeah, and I think that I guess my mind as a demographer goes to the idea, well, actually, we've got this population in Australia right now. We need to take care of this population, and we need to ensure the future of our population is ensured, and that where there are kind of kinks in the generational bargain, or where there are problems with inequality, that those issues are addressed. It's very clear that that generational bargain that we have going, that suggests that generation after generation experiences the same, if not increased, living standards of their parents. We're not seeing that in Australia. So while we've got this kind of fear or panic of perhaps sharing or losing out, whenever we talk about population growth, it need not be about that. We need to change, again, this conversation that I think has been corrupted over time to suit ideological perspectives. Rather, the world is 8 billion strong. We have survived a long history of problems and triumphs. Let today, particularly on a day that Australia celebrates marriage equality, that we now look to the future and consider how can all of Australia, because it's within our gift to change, be equal. And I think that that's where we need to start from. That's our starting point. Let's charter a course now to fulfil those goals of a fairer and more equal society. And I hate to say it, but it comes with the intergenerational wealth accumulation that's occurring at one end of the life course and not being shared among young Australians, because young Australians are confronted with an uncertain future of climate change, of housing affordability issues, of job insecurity and gender inequality. These things must be invested in now. We cannot wait for consensus or for a so-called mandate. Leadership must occur to address these issues.
Craig, I wonder if we need to reassess our relationship with the idea of growth, because right down to the family level, you know, happiness is measured by how many children you have, how big your workforce is. We don't really measure things like happiness. How does an economist kind of weigh that up in these equations?
Well, there is actually a notion of gross national happiness, but you're right, it's pretty hard to compare and add up different people's happiness in economic terms. I won't dwell on this. It's interpersonal comparisons of utility, which can't be done. Some people might be just instinctively very happy and other people less happy, but there are measures of well-being. There was the first inclusion in the budget just brought down of the notion of a well-being budget. I think New Zealand already does that. But to give the perspective, in the turn of the last century, 1900s, there were 2 billion people on Earth, now 8 billion, headed to 11 billion. But the forces themselves are very, very powerful. and Liz would know a lot more than me about this, but the demographic transition was, when I was studying, it was such that people on low incomes tended to have more children, and in part because they don't have a social security system in poor countries. And so that was their social security system, or is, the children. And as they become wealthier, they feel that they need fewer children in their old age, and fewer of them will actually die in their early years. So as countries get richer, there are fewer and fewer children. We've recognised this for a long time. After the Second World War, populate or perish. The first intergenerational report, remember Peter Costello have one baby for mum, one for dad and one for the country. So, you know, this is just an ongoing issue. But if I could add this final point, there is an ecological issue here, and that is there's been a lot of deforestation, which is definitely contributing to climate change. Wouldn't it be great if we could actually find ways of paying landholders to reforest land, which is possible in the future? So I'm not all doom and gloom about the future, but we are still going to see very big increases in global population, and that does have some implications for climate change.
And Pawan, to an extent, our climate crisis as it is now is not easily reversible. I mean, we're kind of locked in right now for several decades to come before any policy changes will have an immediate impact, at least from a population point of view. How do countries like India, which is one of the few that's expected to continue growing, manage that dilemma?
Look, in India, it's certainly a challenge with climate change and the growing population, but there are other opportunities too. In terms of India's population is going to continue to grow till at least 2063. But it's interesting to look at the age group which is growing. There's about 50% of the population below the age of 25 and 65% over the age of 35. So the average age of an Indian is about 29 years, and that's where the opportunities and threats are in terms of the teaching them how to consume things, how to be more ecologically sustainable, and they're very digitally friendly. If I look at it, there's a very large consumer class waiting to be educated. I'm moving a little bit away from your question, but there's a very large consumer class waiting to be educated. Today they need about 1,500 universities, and this is an opportunity for Australia to bring in either Indian students or to export education and teach them issues which are very important to things other than just pure mathematics. From an Indian perspective, a number of them are very digitally qualified, so opportunities in e-learning, e-health, e-finance, and this is where there can be other options available to a growing younger generation to be more understanding of how to be sustainable and how to take care of the climate around them.
Erin, Pawan makes a really good point here about the generational change and expectations that people have, kids have. I mean, I look at my daughter and I think her awareness around the environment and climate is so much greater to what I had when I was 11 years old. Do you think that we can lean on future generations that much to solve the problems that we have created collectively?
Yeah, Jeremy, you're absolutely right. It's a lot more innate to them, isn't it? They seem to really have been picking up these lessons around them and, dare I say it, in school, learning a lot more about sustainability and the environment that we ever did, even though I grew up in, Albany, Western Australia and had a bush area at school. But, they are a very different generation of people. But just to go back to what we were just talking about with India, I mean, India's ambitions to be the largest EV market in the world, there's a lot that we can learn here from India as well in terms of our ambition around things like climate change. But all of this, this 8 billion people, so many of these people are in the global south living in really terrible conditions. And I think that, I'm going out to Dhaka next week in Bangladesh, and I'll be going down to Cox's Bazar with this 1.3 million people living in a refugee camp there, the biggest in the world. That's 5% of Australia's population living in a refugee camp. So even though we've got this enormous global population, the proportion of those people living in rich countries and, who have all of these wonderful opportunities that we're talking about are so small compared to the number of people who are living in really harsh conditions, who are the most impacted by things like climate change as well. So, I think that this is, it's actually, I've got to try and not get down about it, and you go and you do what you can. And, something like Dhaka, I can go and see that and bring those stories and narratives back to Australia, and having opportunities like this to be able to talk about it is one small little piece of that very, very, very big puzzle. But, go back to your original question, kids these days are a lot more. They understand in a way that our generation as, elder millennials and probably Gen Xers and, of course, baby boomers didn't understand.
But Jeremy, there is a positive side to this. I won't go totally down on this. I'll keep a little bit of a positive side on this, that India is projected to have the world's largest labour market, contributing more than USD $500 billion to the global economy by 2030. Its GDP is expected to grow to about 4% by 2027, and it will be the fourth largest economy in the world. And that, along with a population of 1.5 billion, there has to be some trickle-down effects in which the overall standards of the poorer Indians will rise as the economy grows.
Liz, I wonder what you think of that, trickle down. How well does that work?
I knew I had
It's a nice idea, but
phase over there, but I was very curious as to the reaction. I could see your eyes light up, Jeremy.
Look, I'm kind of it's a nice idea, right? And this, there's no absence of ambition here. But Liz, execution again is where we kind of tend to fall down.
In theory, but in practice, right? And I think that India has quite a bright future. As you've just discussed, India has what's known in business as a demographic dividend potentially on its hands. It is about to undergo, given its age structure, enormous economic change and growth. And I think for Australia will benefit from that. Directly and indirectly. And I think that what Australia needs to remember is that we have people come from India to Australia to live and to work and so on. I do hope that Australia gets that reciprocal relationship better, or more right, if you like, if I can say that, in terms of ensuring that people that do come to Australia are well looked after, but also we have this acknowledgement that perhaps the education and the infrastructure in India is benefiting Australia and Australians. And I think that we need to recognise this, particularly because of this unequal relationship potentially between Australia and India.
Now, if there are any doubts about the trickle-down effect, Jeremy, elections are held in India every 5 years, one of the most democratic countries in the world. 660 million people go to vote. And if they're not feeling the economic benefits flowing into them, there would be a change of power.
I'm going to say something about it. All right.
Well, it's also one of the most economically unequal societies in the world. That's a huge problem. Child nutrition is some of the worst in India. Now, I love India as it's a fantastic country, but there are some harsh realities here, right? So this is that balance that we're talking about striking between, the significant opportunities, but making sure that those people who don't have that same access as others are lifted up as well. And, China did that very, very well. They lifted 500 million people out of poverty. And I would love to see India do the same, because that's where both India and the rest of the world, to be quite frank, will see the benefit of this rise in India that we'll see between now and the middle of the century, which isn't that far away.
I'll take that. I mean, if it's a 20-80 rule, I like it to go to 25-75, 30-70. Definitely, that'll be something which will be very exciting to see happen in India.
Now, from poverty, let's go to Jeff Bezos, the Amazon founder. He's vowed to give away most of his $124 billion fortune over his lifetime. And that pledge came after the billionaire's annual Courage and Civility Awards, an event where this year the country singer Dolly Parton won the $100 million funding to spend on charities of her choice. And while Ms Parton was an easy choice for that funding, Mr Bezos told CNN choosing worthy causes was proving difficult.
Building Amazon was not easy. It took a lot of hard work, a bunch of very smart teammates, and I'm finding, and I think Lauren's finding the same thing, that philanthropy is very similar. It's not easy. It's really hard.
Liz, I'm telling you, being a billionaire is hard work. What do you think?
A billionaire 180 times.
Yeah, that's right.
Jeff, we need a chat, mate. You and me, my people can set it up with your people. I can think of lots of worthy causes, friend. Jeff. Jeff.
Give them
Who
the
is
BSB
advising
account number of
Jeff?
Food Bank, honestly.
Oh, my goodness. Do you know what's
Jeff
so hard?
joined the troops of the downtrodden. You know,
He's a victim of his
shoulders,
own making.
slumped shoulders,
Have you started with
carrying
sending
the
him
weight of the whole world on his shoulders. Oh,
Have you started by sending him a request, a Facebook friend request?
I'll just
You
slide
gotta
into
start
his
somewhere.
DMs. I like your smile, Jeff. But I
if
think
you play your
what's so
cards right, you'll get a blue tick on Twitter. You know, I mean, that's worth a couple of billion.
We can all be Liz Allen with a blue tick. Just buy one, don't we?
But I think Jeff needs a reality check, right? Jeff, what Jeff is saying here, we're on a first name basis now, I'm sure. But my concern is that he articulated very nicely what is articulated to people that perhaps are not doing so well economically, is that this rich man worked really hard. This rich man had opportunities granted to him that others did not. So his hard work cannot be compared to someone who started life in a totally different set of socioeconomic circumstances. So the other thing, Jeff is doing something very strategic here. He is greenwashing wealth. And little do a lot of people know, or few people know, is that Jeff is potentially getting PR support here. He is also potentially getting a tax write-off as a result of his philanthropy. This is just part of Jeff's game, and we all are trapped in his kind of network of kind of charade here. So don't be like Jeff. Tell Jeff how to be better. But I think Jeff.
And this is the same day that Amazon laid off 10,000 workers as well. So, you know, I find that really hard to circle, you know, with all of these layoffs that are going on in tech at the moment. Now, yes, put to one side, we all love Dolly Parton, which she's brilliant, right? We know that she is going to spend that money very well through her foundation. But this announcement is coming at the same time as these huge layoffs in the tech industry that hyper-concentrated wealth around the world to a few individual people. So
I'm going to be a contrarian here. I actually think it's a good thing that Jeff Bezos is giving away billions of dollars.
Of course
and if it makes him feel okay on the way through, well, you know, that's all right by
And
me.
Craig, it's a lot better than sending another rocket up in space trying to get somewhere
That's
with
right.
all the other competitions and nobody knows why they're going there anyway. I'm with you,
Yeah.
Craig.
But do you know,
I want you to send
if
him
I
a
can-
Facebook request so that at least you can start the conversation.
Yeah, but his ex-wife, Mackenzie, I read an article that said that in terms of the distribution of that kind of wealth, she actually makes more money than she gives out in that time it takes. So she actually can't give away her money fast enough before she actually makes the same amount back.
She's given away $8 billion, I believe, in the last 10 months.
She's extraordinary, but she probably made more
I've
than
got
that
a few
back.
ideas. Again,
Right?
hardship
But
of the
it's
rich. I'm not
interesting.
sure I'm on board, but like, you know, like good luck to them. I hope some of that lands in the right place. Look, just finally before we go, I want to ask you, what would you do on your birthday? Would you be here on the drum? Because that's exactly what Craig Emerson has done. He accepted our invitation to be here on his birthday. Craig, thank you very much and happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
Happy
very
birthday,
kind of
Craig.
you. The kids
Happy
are taking
birthday.
me
That
out
was
for
probably
dinner
a present.
tonight. We're going out for dinner and then we're going to hit the disco, I think. Well, that's the case anyway.
Disco.
Have fun. That's all we have time for. Thanks to our panel, Pawan Luthra, Erin Watson, Craig Emerson, Liz Allen. Have an excellent evening. Catherine Robinson will be back with you tomorrow. Bye-bye.